left because you could only get so many people in at a time. So families would come when they could get through, when they could get visas to get through. And so it took 20 years before all these people were actually in the same room together, which is why they went and created this sort of old school photoshopped family photograph. But anyway, just kind of an interesting sort of consequence of that system. As I mentioned, we're a nation of immigrants. The Chinese were not the only people that we were concerned about. As the century went on, the types of immigrants that were coming from Europe became different, right? The Irish came first, and there was concern about the Irish because they were Catholic. And we didn't really like that, right? Because we're mostly a Protestant nation. And then you started to get more and more immigrants from Southern Europe, Italy, right? And those guys spoke an entire other language. And then Germans, right? And various other groups that fell out of the category of what are known as WASPs. Okay, has anybody ever heard the term WASP? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Okay, that was like the traditional model for what an American was, right? You came from somewhere in England, you were Protestant, and that's who we were in favor of. So this is a political cartoon from the 1890s, kind of showing that these guys, now established gentlemen, American gentlemen, prosperous gentlemen, and then you see their shadows are their forefathers who were probably Irish or Italian or what have you, and now here they are trying to bar this German guy from coming in, right? And so there was a lot of political commentary on this, but increasingly we were regulating immigration because immigration was increasing. And so again, America is unique in this sense, and that's why it's always an issue for us as a country, is trying to deal with the issue of immigration, because we all come from, or nearly all of us come from some sort of immigrant stock, but at the same time there's always this question of, well, like, how many people can we take in, right? Like, how many can we absorb? And so it becomes a serious issue in this time period. But I point both of these out because, again, they kind of underscore that isolationist idea of America, right? Of, it's okay for people to come here, and then we're kind of concerned about what type of people are coming here. But we're used to people coming to us. We're not used to going to them, right? People aren't leaving the United States in large numbers to go to other places. And so we have to deal with, we mostly think in these more parochial terms. So again, how and why did the US make the transition to becoming a global power at the turn of the last century? And I hope everybody knows what that term means, but when we say turn of the last century, we mean late 1800s, early 1900s, right? When we turn from one century to another. So how did we make that transition? One factor is what had happened in America. This is Frederick Jackson Turner. If you ever study the history of the American West, it all starts with this guy. He was sort of the first historian of the American West. And you always have to start with the Turner thesis, which was basically the idea that the frontier had closed. As it says here, up to our own day, American history has been, in a large degree, the history of the colonization of the Great West. And I think if you'll reflect back on what we've talked about so far, there's a lot of truth to that, right? The existence of an area of free land, that's kind of a debatable term, but existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, meaning we keep pushing back that frontier, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. The West is now closed, right? And he's right. This is the 1890s. By this point, nearly every single Native American tribe has been confined to some sort of reservation. We have passed legislation that allows for Americans to actually go and take land out of some of those reservations if it doesn't seem like it's being used. We've pretty thoroughly conquered, right, continental America. And so then that leaves us with this question of, well, what's next, right? And that's kind of what Turner talks about, is what is next for America after we've gone and conquered so much of the world. Well, a few issues kind of help determine the direction of the United States. One is Cuba. Hey, Cuba. So Cuba has an interesting history, and we'll follow it through the rest of the class with regard to the United States. But Cuba's very close to us, right? It's not that far from the United States. And during the late 1800s, Cuba was a Spanish colony. Actually, Spain considered it a province, considered it important, so it called it a province. And Cubans started to revolt, right, and seek freedom. And as Americans, that kind of appealed to us, right? A revolution against a colonial authority. We liked all that sort of thing. And so Americans were kind of interested in what was going on. There was a lot of conversation about it. There wasn't a lot of action taken, but as the conflict escalated, it became more and more of an issue for America, in part because of our concern about, freedom, people seeking freedom from their colonial rulers, but also in part for economic reasons, because all of the chaos in Cuba was disrupting economic activity out of Cuba, which was pretty significant, sugar in particular, which was produced there. So what happened? Well, kind of like with the Mexican-American War, where we just kind of said, let's go and put troops down by the border and wait until somebody shoots, and then we'll start a war, right? We kind of did the same thing. We had a lot of ships going in to sort of theoretically help stabilize the situation, and one of them was a ship called the Maine. And the Maine, while it was in harbor outside of Havana, blows up. And it blows up, and the reaction to it looked kind of like this when it was all done. A number of American sailors were killed, and the reaction to it was pretty swift, thanks to, in part, what we call yellow journalism. So at this point, we have a lot of papers that are very sensationalistic. Actually, this is pretty similar to a phenomenon we have now with fake news, right? But newspapers would try and print like the most, sensationalistic headlines that they could. And so when the Maine blows up, the New York Journal, which was definitely one of the part of the yellow journalism, owned by William Randolph Hearst, goes and says that the destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy, $50,000 reward for the detection of the perpetrator. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt, hey, that guy shows up, convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident, and so forth and so on, right? So they go and they make a big to-do about all this, and it becomes sort of the impetus. Now, McKinley, who's president at the time, had been trying to just stabilize things, negotiate a peaceful situation, but this really turned the American people in favor of intervention in Cuba. And then we get things like this, right, that kind of portray the Spanish as like monsters, right? Killing American soldiers, stomping on the American flag there, right? You got all these men in uniform dead over here. We got all these sorts of things that help to sensationalize the issue and bring America into the war. So Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, right, run into battle along with a number of other people. Spain, we have to remember, at one point controlled most of the Americas, and by this point have lost almost all their colonies. And so they had basically said, we will fight as long as we have to in order to keep Cuba, because it was about all they had left. But they were such a decaying empire at this time that they were able to put up very little resistance relative to the power of the American military and the swiftness with which America was able to move forces there. So we defeated them pretty quickly. Now, when we defeated them, it created a situation because not only did we effectively win Cuba from them, but we won all of their other holdings left in the Pacific Ocean. We got Puerto Rico, we got the Philippines, we got several other island nations, right? And we had annexed Hawaii about the same time. So as this thing depicts, now the United States is no longer just that little continental piece there that we originally started out with. We've also purchased Alaska. It now stretches 10,000 miles from tip to tip, as this talks about. But this creates a really intriguing problem for us, because in the Philippines, they had been fighting against the Spanish, and in Cuba, they had been fighting against the Spanish for their independence. Now, we kind of own these places. Did we just become another empire, right? So and this was the question that America was suddenly stuck with. And so what the approach was that we said, no, these are protectorates of the United States. So it's basically our job to protect them, but that means military intervention if we have to, in order to protect them even from themselves, right? And so it creates a very interesting scenario for the United States. It's worth noting the scale of the British Empire at this point. They had Canada, they had parts in South America, huge chunk that ran through Africa, India, massive country in terms of population, various other holdings throughout the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, etc. This tiny little island up here controlled an area with a population of 300 million at this time, right? And so as it could be said that the sun never set on the British Empire because it covered the whole globe. And America didn't want this, but at the same time, it kind of did, right? Like, again, there was this sort of, well, the British have an empire, we're kind of behind the game. And Teddy Roosevelt specifically felt like the United States should have an empire. He was very overtly imperialistic. He thought that the United States should control territory, should have a certain role in that. Part of this also is cultural. There's like a cultural justification for all of this, and it's a concept called the white man's burden, which shows up here in this advertisement for soap, of all things. But it is actually a pretty common metaphor for the white man's burden, which is the idea that white Anglo-Saxons have this burden, this duty to go and bring civilization to the uncivilized world, right? And so there's this idea, kind of represented by the soap, of a sort of cleaning up the world, right? Turning these savages into real human beings, right? And so that was kind of the justification for British Empire, and Teddy Roosevelt didn't think that it was that far off, right? For all of his, progressive thoughts in terms of racial equality and so forth, part of it was just that he liked adventure, right? I mean, we figured that out from Teddy, right? And so he just liked the idea of the sort of warfare it would take in order to create an empire, right? Like in his journals, over and over again, the main thing that he expresses is how sad he was that there wasn't a war during his term as president, right? Because he wanted to lead the country through a war. That was part of what he wanted to do. His opinion does later change when, during World War I, he's so impatient to get his sons involved in World War I that he actually is able to get his one son to get a position with the Royal Air Force, the English Air Force, and his son is shot down and killed. And that begins to change Teddy's thinking. But up to that point, right, he had seen it just as this sort of glorious adventure, this very manly American thing to do, right? But anyway, that concept was in there. But what we do is we have this protectorate system where we now have these territories, and this is about as good as it gets in terms of explaining the approach to it. Here we have Uncle Sam. This is called School Begins. So you got Uncle Sam sternly looking at these 4 kids here in the front row, right, who are labeled Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Philippines. And I got to walk right up to it to read it. It's old enough and bad enough. Okay. So Uncle Sam, to this front row of the class, says, now children, what does it say? I looked at it earlier by magnifying it to like 800%. You're going to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just look at the class ahead of you, and you'll see in a little while, yet you will be glad that you did and as good as they are. So he's referring to the next grade, which is apparently this group of white kids over here. And if you go and look at their books, this one is labeled California, Texas. I think we got Kansas over here. Anyway, so the idea being that, look, we're going to, very much white man's burden type concept, we're going to civilize you, right? So that you can be like the rest of America. Meanwhile, you do have a little Chinese kid who is not allowed inside, okay? And then you have what is clearly a stereotypical Indian child reading his book upside down, right? Like, so if you want a depiction of all of the racism and biases of the country at the time, this is about as good as it gets. Now, why were the people in the Philippines trying to win freedom from the Spanish? The answer is they had been trying for a long time, and the Spanish had been incredibly brutal. This picture depicts one of the ways in which they would execute people in the Philippines, the garrote. And as you can see, it's just like a vice that they would twist until you killed the person, right? Choked them to death. Pretty brutal ways of fighting. And they'd been fighting a brutal war with their Spanish overlords for a long time. Well, it turns out that the Philippines, the native Tagalog people in the Philippines, did not want to be an American protectorate. And they just saw them as another imperial overlord, and they still wanted their independence. And so then America is suddenly faced with this challenge in terms of what do we do in response to this sort of response. And we wind up in a very interesting situation trying to decide how we deal with this. And the answer is that we deal with it militarily and very brutally as well. I got to pull something up here real quick. This right here is called water curing. So this is a depiction of it from Life magazine. It was kind of the predecessor of waterboarding. And it was a system used extensively by American troops in the Philippines in order to torture people to either get a confession out of them or what have you. And let me just find this. We have a lot of other examples, right? This is called Lucky Filipinos, where it shows, a burning village and people lying dead. It appears the Filipinos have lost confidence in Americans. Do those benighted wretches fail to realize what we have accomplished in their islands? We may have burnt certain villages, destroyed considerable property, and incidentally slaughtered a few thousand of their sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, etc. But what did they expect? Were we to transport an army more than halfway around the earth merely to hasten to peace propositions? not much, and look at Manila. Anyway, so this is actually a little satirical one that challenges what is going on in the Philippines. Okay, I got it. Here we go. The extent of our fighting was terrible. We killed a lot of people in battle. This is from the first day of battle in the Philippines. They would just fill trenches full of bodies. And a lot of civilians were killed. There were numerous instances where an order would be given just to kill everybody who, men, women, children in a particular village and burn it down. Now, when we start to talk about Vietnam later, there are a lot of precursors to what happens in Vietnam with what we do in the Philippines. But I want to share a quote or two. I actually have a set of letters that are from people who fought in the war, the Philippine-American War. This is from Ellis G. Davis of Company A, the 20th Kansas. He says, "They will never surrender until their whole race is exterminated. They are fighting for a good cause, and the Americans should be the last of all nations to transgress upon such rights. Their independence is dearer to them than life, as ours was in years gone by, and is today. They should have their independence, and would have had it if those who make the laws in America had not been so slow in deciding the Philippine question. Of course, we have to fight now to protect the honor of our country, but there is not a man who enlisted to fight these people, and should the United States annex these islands, none but the most bloodthirsty will claim himself a hero. This is not a lack of patriotism, but my honest belief." Anyway, I could read probably, I've got 20 here that are all, they're not all exactly like that. Some of them feel like what they're doing. This one, he says, "Talk about dead Indians, why they are lying everywhere. The trenches are full of them. More harrowing still, think of the brave men from this country, men who were willing to sacrifice their lives for the freedom of Cuba, dying in battle and from disease in a war waged for the purpose of conquering people who were fighting as the Cubans fought against Spanish tyranny and misrule." Right? So as a country, this becomes our first big dilemma in terms of what do we do, right? Like, how do we respond to, are we an empire or are we something else? Are we going to play the same game that England and France are playing with colonies all over the world? Or are we going to do something separate? Now, as I said, Roosevelt was very much in favor of creating an empire. He created what was called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which said not only will we, it actually has a weird caveat. It says, so the Monroe Doctrine says we're going to stop Europeans from creating new colonies in the Americas. The Roosevelt Corollary actually says, but for European nations that already have colonies in the Americas, if they require military intervention in order to restore peace, we will do it for them, right? So just a very weird rule, basically saying that, hey, we're going to be, and this is where we actually get the idea. He talks about us becoming an international policing force for the world, right? And so that role really begins here. A good example of Teddy Roosevelt's actual involvement in these sorts of actions was the Panama Canal. Panama, right in here, where we wanted to cut through so that we could cut, in order to get around from one side of America to the other by boat, was quite a trip, right? We had to go all the way around South America. This cuts out many thousands of miles of sea voyage if we can just cut a little slice through here and get through right here. So he approached what was Colombia at the time, owned all of this, and tried to negotiate for to buy the land so that they could create a canal so that ships could get through. And there was a Panama Canal Company that was involved in this whole process, and had argued for, or was trying to get this canal built. And Colombia agreed at a certain point, but then they wanted more money, right? And they kept asking for more money. And eventually, the Panama Canal Company, with like some tacit background help from Roosevelt, convinced the Panamanians to actually have a revolution and break free of Colombia. So they helped start a revolution in Panama, and then it becomes its own country, and then of course we're able to build a canal, right? And here's a good photo of Teddy Roosevelt. He goes to visit the dig site. There he is in his white suit. It seems like a very bad idea, just in terms of, I wouldn't dress in an all-white suit to go dig a canal personally, but it looks pretty clean, so he managed it. But they dig this canal, and it takes quite a long time past the term of his presidency in order to complete it. Meanwhile, he also, again, Roosevelt believed in naval power as being really critical. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had talked about the Navy all of his life. And so he creates what's called the Great White Fleet, which was a fleet of battleships that were modern steel ships, right? And they went and painted the sides white so that they would be very, very visible. And then he sends them on a world tour where they basically bounce around and kind of just go to a bunch of different ports. Now, this wasn't that uncommon, but the scale of it and so forth was. And it was basically a way, in Teddy Roosevelt's mind, it was to prepare the Navy, it was a reason to build up the Navy, but it was also to go and show places like Spain, like the English, like various places controlled as colonies, and in particular Japan, which was a growing force, that we were a power, right? That we were becoming powerful, and that the country needed to recognize that. Well, as much as Teddy Roosevelt was committed, at least verbally committed, to the idea of imperialism, he didn't actually do that much to advance American empire. I can point to those two things, you know, his involvement in Cuba, fighting there, but he didn't really do that much. On the other hand, Woodrow Wilson, a guy who seems to have been opposed to the idea of imperialism, got us in more military conflicts within the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, than any other president in history, before or since. He sent troops into Haiti. He sent them to the Dominican Republic. He sent troops all over the place, and most importantly, he sent them to Mexico, because there had been a revolution. There had actually been two revolutions in quick succession that put a dictator in power, and Woodrow Wilson decided to intervene. Now, Woodrow Wilson's reasons are a little bit different, and this is extremely important, okay? Memorize this, because it's going to be a theme that you're going to see through the rest of any international affairs that we talk about. Woodrow Wilson intervenes because he believes that the United States has a moral obligation, when possible, to spread its ideals, democracy in particular, to the rest of the world, even if that's at the barrel of a gun, right? And so when a dictatorship takes over in Mexico, he sends Marines in to try and support one of there are actually three different guys kind of vying for power, and he sends in troops to sort of support this one person who he thinks is most likely to not create a dictatorship if he takes power. But everybody in Mexico they don't welcome these Marines. They see it as an invasion. It goes very badly for him. He then tries to support another group, and part of that involves supporting a guy named Pancho Villa. And then at a certain point, he thinks, no, that group, they're less likely to be able to take over. And so he backs out and takes away his support. And it's just this mess, right? This shows Mexican policy. And Woodrow Wilson, just like, he's got this pepper grinder called force. And he's like, if I can just keep adding enough force into this thing, eventually it's going to work out, right? But instead, he just creates a lot of enemies. And Pancho Villa is a really good example. So he had supported Pancho Villa and then stopped, and then Pancho's power sort of collapsed, and he felt betrayed. So he went north, attacked a train in New Mexico, dragged everybody out and killed them. And then he went and attacked a town in New Mexico and kind of razed the town, burned it, killed a lot of people there. Wilson again decides military force is required, and so he sends some people after Pancho Villa. Let's guess, how many people does Woodrow Wilson send in order to capture this one guy?
5,000.
Times that by 2 and you got it, all right? He sends 10,000 soldiers into Mexico in order to capture this one guy. And the Mexicans basically outflank him. They create a situation where he would never capture Pancho Villa, and he doesn't. So he sends a general and 10,000 soldiers into Mexico trying to capture this Pancho Villa guy. But in the meantime, other issues have arisen. World War I. World War I. So World War I is one of the weirdest wars in terms of its start. Like, we know that it has to do with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and then that somehow creates a war. And this is never well explained. But basically what happens is that you have a situation that had kind of held peace in Europe for a while, which was they created a system where we would kind of create secret agreements, right? Secret alliances. So I'm allied with this group, right? I'm allied with this country, and I'm allied with this country, right? And the idea was that with so many different alliances, nobody would start a war with anybody else because they would all start to click in place, right? Because if you attack me, then this guy who's allied with me has to come in, and that country that's allied with him has to come into the war, and so forth. And so the idea was that it would prevent war from ever happening until somebody gets assassinated, and then all of a sudden it makes a giant war, right? So everybody goes to war with each other. So you wind up with a few neutral countries, but you wind up with the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, Serbia, Romania, Greece, Russia, and then the Central powers, including the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire as on the other side. And these two set to war in a huge way. A couple of things about this war. I'm going to skip ahead and just talk about the war for a minute. A couple of things about the war that we need to understand. This was a different war. This was the first really modern war. Germany had gone and they had invested in creating a bunch of heavy artillery, howitzers, and these super guns that were things like this, that if you can tell, this thing is designed to go along on a railroad track. So it's mobile, and then it has this